Hi everybody. Today I'm going to be interviewing Katya Belorusets, who is here with me today. She's a very good friend of mine. We've known each other for 8 years. She immigrated to the United States from Russia, and so I thought she would be a good person to talk to and have her share her experiences. So I've got 3 important questions that I'd like to ask you, and there is no right or wrong answer, just share with us what you have to say. First of all, what was it like for your family to move from Russia to the United States?
Well, when I was 12 years old, my mother and my father decided that they would apply for permission to move to America. And I was deaf, and I needed to have special permission in order to be employed. And my family also thought about what would be a better life for me and my future in the United States. So we filled out the application, and they said that we were not accepted because I was deaf, and that I would not be able to look for a job in the United States. So our application was declined. We tried the next year applying using a different reason, and we were declined again. So I initially started at the age of 12, and then it wasn't until I finally was 16 years old that we were accepted to move, and that was because we are Jewish on my father's side, so we were accepted on the basis of being a Jew. And it helped us also because we had cousins on my father's side who are already in the United States, and so we could use them as a source to get us there. My father was going to look for work and go to school. I was also going to be enrolling in school again, primarily for me to improve my English. I would say it was about 2.5 years before I graduated high school. Then I moved on to a community college. After the community college, I went to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., where I stayed for 4 years, majoring in recreation. I also minored in art. When I was done with my studies at Gallaudet, I realized I needed to have an income to improve my state of life. I decided to look for work in San Francisco, working part-time, temporarily, and eventually finding a real job in the Department of Recreation, and also teaching American Sign Language to people who are not deaf, which I did part-time, and it's been great so far. Now, the experience that I had moving to the United States was quite an ordeal. It's very different for me, culturally especially. Did you have any specific questions you wanted to ask me about that? Because I could elaborate.
Well, I did want to ask you, related to your experience moving to the United States, how you went about getting your entry documents so that you could come to the country legally. How did you do that?
Oh, sure. My cousin was the one who helped us. He was the one who helped us get the papers to fill out and send to the embassy so that we could be invited to come to the United States, which means that he was also like a sponsor for us. He was responsible for us. He was responsible for my family, his relatives. He knew that we were Jewish and that America respected us as being Jews, and it was easier for us to fill out the application and be invited to the United States for that reason.
Okay. What was it like for you to assimilate into American culture?
Well, I have to tell you, it was a challenge, really. At first, I think I was about 17 and a half by the time we finally moved to the United States. And I was in the 10th grade in high school when I left Russia, moving here, and I enrolled again into the 10th grade. And of course, I needed to have 4 years of English credits in the United States high school, so that means my graduation was postponed by a year. One of the first Americans I met how should I say this? Of course, they were intrigued by my experience coming to the United States and that I came from a different culture, and they were, excited to listen to what I had to say. But in Russia, we were pretty much a homogeneous crowd. We had a particular lifestyle back there, and we didn't have a very substantial income. And everybody pretty much lived in the same location, knew each other, knew everybody's customs and traditions, and knew each other very well because we saw each other all the time. And we were much more creative and being able to share with people, and we would barter and trade because we all earned the same minimum wage, really meager pay, and so it would be very difficult if one of us earned more than the other. So we decided that we would mutually support each other, and a lot of that was by barter and trade. I guess you could say we're all on the same page. And so I would tell the Americans about my experience back home and my simple life and all of that, and of course they were intrigued by that. And then, coming to America, there's so many more options in life and sometimes too much information, and they became more and more fascinated by the ordeal that I had to go through, and I would explain what it was like. And they were pretty much quiet on their end. They pretty much kept to themselves. They never really shared with me. I don't know if they shared with anybody else. And I wish that after I told them about me and my experience, that they would have shared their experience with me. And I don't feel that it was mutual. It's not like we exchanged equal information. I'm sure other people must have had similar experiences to mine because they came from different cultures, but really when I arrived here, I did not understand American culture. It was very new to me, and it took a very long process for me to assimilate. And after about 6 months, I started to realize how different it was, and that I wanted to preserve my culture and my accent, I guess you could say. And in America, to me, there were just too many options. And I started to feel like I really preferred being back home. I really did not fully understand the American culture, and it was just so much easier to go back to one that was familiar to me. And I would frequently cry, and my mother would say, "Oh, no, you just have to be patient. You'll get used to it. Once you understand it better, it will be better for you. Just give it time." And it was more a sense of finding the right people who had similar experiences to mine, people who had also had a very tough time growing up, who could relate when I would talk to them about the differences that I experienced in American culture compared to my upbringing, and that eventually I would begin to prefer it here. And then being a deaf person on top of that, what kind of employment opportunities were there here? We also have the laws that protect the disabled here in America, that you don't have the same kind of protection as a disabled person. There aren't as many services in Russia. You just pretty much stayed home, or you had to be so dependent on your parents, and I really did not want that for myself. So that, I have to say, was one thing I cherished about American culture. I always will cherish my Russian heritage because of the length of time I spent there and how much that was an integral part of who I am. But I guess that kind of explains the process of my assimilation. If I missed anything, I'm sure you'll ask me another question or so.
My third question is, what kind of cultural challenges did you face in the process of becoming a U.S. citizen? What challenges did you have?
Well, let me think about it. I do remember moving to the United States. I have to admit that America is very beautiful, and at first I didn't think it was much of a challenge. But then later, when I actually went through the process of becoming a citizen, I realized what a challenge it really was. Let me explain how this whole process started. First of all, the government said that they would give us a green card, which meant we had to completely adhere to all the laws. If there were any violations, in other words, if we broke the law even once, they would send my family and I back to Russia. So that meant we would lose everything here that we worked so hard for, and we couldn't afford to do that, and we had to work so much harder than the rest of you Americans. I mean, you take it all for granted. If you have a little minor infraction off the time, often it gets dismissed, but not for us. It was such a very serious time for for us, but we knew that it was worth it because it was definitely going to be a much better way of life here and worth the struggle that we had to go through. So for those 3 years, my family and I were very careful, make sure we didn't have any violations, and we finally were approved and granted a green card. We were then given another 2 years because it takes that long to get all the documentation squared away. You're often placed on a waiting list, and during that time you have to be very, very careful. Again, we're given green cards and we have to closely adhere to the law. Any kind of infraction, we might lose the chance of becoming a citizen. So if you count the 3 years to get the green card and the 2 years after that, it was 5 years for us to go through the process of becoming citizens. I remember when my family and I went in there and they took each of our pictures. I felt like we were lining up to go to prison or something, the way they made us stand and have our pictures taken, and they also scrutinized our passports. And we were in what was like a courtroom, and we all had to raise our right hands and do solemnly swear that we would uphold the Constitution of the United States and all the laws therein, and that we would, for example, if Russia would happen to start a war against the United States, that we would, of course, support the United States because we were now residents here, and that we would drop our allegiance to Russia in that sense. So they were testing us to become citizens. There was a test that was 100 questions about American history, which was a challenge because my family and I only knew a very little about American history. But we studied diligently and we learned all about America's history, and were able to take the test. And different than the new Americans, you guys could study anytime and sort of acquired it vicariously, whereas we had to invest the serious time to study for the test. And I do remember this one question that this gentleman asked us, and it was a bit personal if you ask me. And he said, if the United States and Russia were to be involved in a war, what would you do? Whose side would you take? And I said, if I'm a U.S. citizen, then of course I would support the United States. Of course, he thought that was funny, but it was true. It was true, even though we weren't officially United States citizens yet, it was true. That's what I would do. I managed to pass all the questions. I think it was because I'd studied so hard. And I felt confident that they were going to send us United States citizenship, and because we had gone through so many of the hoops already, we were starting to relax a little bit, and it wasn't quite the ordeal it was when we first got